Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Sudaso and this is our weekly monk chat session, an opportunity to ask questions about Buddhism and hopefully get some responses. So feel free to type in questions at any time and I'll answer them as they come. So we'll start with paying homage to the Buddha and then I'll start going through the discourses. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So first off, hello to the people joining in online. Hello to Joseph, Carol, Ryan, Maria, Yong, Harry, Victoria, Kaiser Friend, Sean, Lydia, Mary, Jayanta, Hasanta, Manal, and anyone else who is joining in. So, first question we have here is from Joe. Joe says, do you have enough requisites? Yeah, I'm doing okay, thank you. And Joe says, could you share the names of who fed you today so we may rejoice in their generosity? So today, Dana was offered to the Sangha by Sud and by Torah. And yesterday it was Imelda. So we've had many wonderful people coming to offer food to the Sangha. And Joe also says, what is a good gift for someone who's dying? And he says, I asked one of our Dharma friends who's a hospice nurse the same question, and their answer was deep presence. What does deep presence mean to you? Well, I personally do not normally do hospice care. So I'm really not the best person to ask because it's not actually something I have much experience with. So I think the answer that your hospice nurse friend gave is probably a pretty good one. But as to what exactly they mean by deep presence, you would have to ask them what they mean by that. So I can't answer what somebody else means by their words. And Carol says, referring to Majjhima Nikaya 106, Ananja Sapaya Sutta, there's a quote of a translation here that says, the best thing to grasp is the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. Any words to help clarify? Well, it'd be useful to see the Pali phrase that's being translated as such, and also a bit of a better sense of the context for that statement. But I think more what the Buddha's getting at here is he's saying how, of course, any kind of grasping is ultimately a cause for being stuck in samsara. It's ultimately a cause of suffering. But if one is going to grasp at any of the various things that lead to suffering, then ideally the more subtle, the more refined, the more removed from core sensuality, the better. So the experience of neither perception nor non-perception is an extremely advanced meditative attainment, far beyond what most practitioners will get anywhere close to in their life. And it's defined as an extremely peaceful state of mind in which one has dropped all distinctions. And yet it is still a temporary experience which is not accompanied by liberating wisdom. So I think more the point there is that of all the things which are not liberating wisdom, of all the things which do not lead to awakening, if one is going to grasp at any of all the things that are not liberating wisdom, then something so refined and subtle and completely disconnected from desire and aversion is ideal. But of course, the ideal thing, if you really want to grasp at something, the best thing to grasp at is the Noble Eightfold Path, because that is what will lead you to the relinquishment of all grasping. And that's what the Buddha says elsewhere in the suttas. So then Ryan says, Could you kindly explain the practice of if the practice of Satipatthana is Vipassana, and how should it be practiced? Before samatha and samadhi, after in conjunction, or how, please? So it depends on what exactly you mean by Satipatthana. If you look in the Satipatthana Sutta, which is often the main place that people go to for understanding what Satipatthana means, you'll find that in each section it says that one observes the arising and ceasing of that Satipatthana. So, for example, mindful of the body, one is aware of the arising and ceasing of body experiences. Aware of feeling, one is aware of the arising and ceasing of feeling. Aware of mind states, one is aware of the arising and ceasing of mind states, and so on. So the cultivation, the recognition of impermanence then is incorporated into every refrain of the Satipatthana Sutta. And the recognition of impermanence is, in fact, the primary form of insight meditation that we see spoken about in the suttas. Also in the refrain is mentioned that one does not grasp at anything in the world. One does not appropriate anything in the world. So this also is referring to another aspect of the cultivation of insight, the cultivation of vipassana, which is relinquishing all phenomena and also relinquishing all identity ultimately. So not grasping at anything in the world, not appropriating anything in the world also means not formulating a self-identity in relationship to anything in the world. So that, in fact, is anatta sanya, the perception of non-self, which is the highest, the most direct, the most refined, and also the most difficult form of vipassana practice. So in that sense, then, the Satipatthana Sutta does include instructions on vipassana, on insight meditation. That said, there's also elsewhere in the suttas where Satipatthana is spoken about without reference to those insight practices, where it's spoken about purely in terms of cultivating clear awareness of one's body, feelings, mind states, and mental objects, in which case it doesn't have necessarily included a wisdom component, which is why commonly when we talk about cultivating a meditation practice, we talk about three aspects of that meditation practice, which is sati, samadhi, and panya. So sati is the cultivation of mindfulness, of clear awareness, which would include satipatthana practice. Samadhi is the unification and stabilization of mind. And panya is the cultivation of insight, of clearly seeing the three characteristics of whatever one is observing, clearly seeing the impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and impersonal nature of every experience that's arising within our field of awareness. As for your question, should vipassana be before samatha and samadhi, after in conjunction, or how? Well, I mean, of course, the classic sutta on this is the Yuganadda Sutta, in which the Buddha says that there are, in fact, 4 ways of practicing samatha vipassana. One way is to first practice samatha, and then when the mind is stable, bright, alert, peaceful, clearly aware, then one cultivates vipassana. So first samatha, then vipassana. And throughout the history of Buddhism, this has been the most common way of practicing. The second way the Buddha mentioned is to first practice vipassana, then afterwards to cultivate samatha, cultivate samadhi. So in this way, one is initially practicing some insight, and this can be very useful to counteract one's hindrances. If one has very strong hindrances, such as strong desire, strong aversion, strong agitation, strong dullness, then initially focusing on cultivating insight can be a way of weakening those hindrances, so that then it becomes easier to cultivate samadhi, to cultivate stillness and stability of mind. And that stillness of stability of mind then supports the deepening and refinement of one's insight. So throughout the suttas, the Buddha does make it extraordinarily clear, inescapably obvious, in fact, that powerful samadhi is necessary in order to have liberating insight. That without right samadhi, which means practicing jhanas, without right samadhi, it is impossible to attain awakening. It is impossible to develop sufficiently strong and clear insight. So then the practice of first vipassana, then samatha, then naturally is done so that one samatha supports the deepening of one's vipassana. Then the third method mentioned in the Yuganada Sutta, which is where the name of the sutta comes from. So Yuganada means conjoined or in conjunction. And the third one is the Buddha says one cultivates samatha and vipassana simultaneously in conjunction. And one of the clearest description, or one of the clearest forms of this in the Buddhist world is in fact the practice of silent illumination, as it's called in the Chinese tradition, or shikantaza as it's called in the Japanese tradition, but which is found all the way in the early Buddhist discourses under the name animitta samadhi, objectless concentration. So this is a way of practicing which is the simultaneous cultivation of both samatha and vipassana using the same method, the same object. So not using different methods, but using the same method. One is cultivating both samatha and vipassana. And there's a handful of such methods in the Buddhist world, and all of them have the characteristic of being extremely subtle and difficult to do correctly. But there are, in fact, these conjoined samatha vipassana practices, which can be found in the Buddhist world. Then the fourth method the Buddha mentions has been a subject of debate for 2,500 years. My mind is blanking on the Pali off the top of my head. Dhammodatta Patigahita, something like that. Which basically means that the mind is seized by agitation about the Dhamma. But then after a period of time, the mind stabilizes and sees clearly. So again, there's different opinions about what the fourth one means, and people mostly just focus on the first three because those are more clear. Noticing again that all three of them depend upon powerful samadhi. And none of them, what you won't find on this list is you will not find a pure vipassana approach. Because in the early Buddhist suttas, there is no such thing as a vipassana-only approach to awakening. It just doesn't exist. So the invention of so-called dry insight methods is something which has nothing whatsoever to do with the Buddhist teachings. The Buddha only ever spoke about vipassana as something which necessarily depends upon samatha. So without powerful concentration, without incredibly stable and unified mind, it is impossible to cultivate sufficiently deep and profound insight. So the modern popularity of so-called dry insight meditation is, in fact, blatantly contrary to the Buddha's original teachings. And Ryan says, are there noticeable changes in a person that has penetrated into the three characteristics? If so, what are they? Well, it depends on what you mean by penetrated into the three characteristics. That could be a colloquial way of talking about a stream enterer. And fortunately, the Buddha actually gives a clear description of how stream enterers behave. One of the clearer descriptions is found in the Kosambhya Sutta, where the Buddha lays out what's sometimes called the reviewing factors of a stream enterer, where he goes through a description of several different, if I recall, it's 7. It's either 7 or 10. I think it's 7. 7 and then plus the 3 factors of stream entry for a total of 10. So he goes through a list of ways of discerning after the fact if someone is a stream enterer. And what's interesting about this list is that all of them are about permanent changes in behavior. When talking about how to identify stream entry, the Buddha doesn't actually talk so much about the moment of stream entry itself, but rather he talks about the permanent transformation which is observable afterwards. permanent change in one's character and behavior, in one's attitudes. And this is very important because, again, in later meditation traditions, there came to be a lot of effort to try to define exactly what the moment of stream entry is supposed to feel like. And this has led then to a lot of people having some kind of weird experience during meditation and then thinking, oh, that sounds similar to the description of stream entry that I read in this book by Sayadaw so-and-so. And then they convince themselves that they're stream enterers. And so it's interesting then that the Buddha himself did not use that approach at all. Rather than focusing on trying to give some definitive description of what the moment of stream entry feels like, instead the Buddha gave a description of the permanent alteration in behavior and character that is observable in a person after stream entry. And so over the years, I've met quite a number of people who have claimed to be stream enterers. None of them came even remotely close to matching the Buddha's descriptions of how a stream enterer acts. But all of them had at some point had some kind of wild, far-out experience during meditation and had convinced themselves that that meant they were stream enterers. So again, if you're talking about noticeable changes in a person that has become a stream enterer, I would encourage you to read the Kosambhya Sutta, because that gives the clearest description that I've seen in the suttas. Okay. Victoria says, can you please define volitional formations? Is there a translation you prefer that helps people understand the concept a bit more clearly? Yes, there is a translation which helps. So that is one of the less satisfying translations of the word sankhara when it's used in the 5 khandhas. So the 5 khandhas are the 5 components of body and mind. And the word khandha itself often gets translated awkwardly. I translate khandha simply as component, the 5 components of body and mind. You'll commonly see it translated as aggregate. Just briefly, people in this room, what the hell is an aggregate? Did anybody actually know the meaning of the word aggregate before studying Buddhism? Does anybody even currently know the meaning of the word aggregate?
Scientific thing.
In other words, no.
Isn't it like the sum total of the average?
Yeah, which has nothing to do with Buddhism. Yeah, so actually where the word aggregate is most commonly used is in masonry. When you have a collection of different kinds of minerals and stones and things and you mix them all together, that's called an aggregate. So the only time I've ever heard the word aggregate outside of Buddhism was when we had a stonemason coming to examine the brickwork of this building. Then he started talking about what kind of aggregate was used to make the mortar between the bricks. That was literally the only time I've heard the word aggregate used outside of a Buddhist context. So khandha means component, and the 5 components of body and mind, the 4th one is called sankhara. And in that context, sankhara means mental activities or mental processes. So rather than say volitional formations, which, what the hell does volitional formations mean? Like if you just encounter the phrase volitional formations, anyone, what does that mean? Anyone? No one. But if somebody says mental activities, do you have some idea what that might be referring to? Yes, I'm getting nodding. Okay. So mental activities, that's what it means. Mm-hmm. So that said, I have nothing but infinite respect for my fellow translators of Buddhist texts. It is incredibly challenging to accurately translate texts in a way which is readily comprehensible to the target audience. So although I do often nitpick other translators' works, I also have immeasurable respect for what they do. So Lydia says, why would it matter what gender someone identifies with if they ordain? It doesn't matter at all. From the perspective of Dhamma, it actually doesn't matter at all. Says, wouldn't they look or act no different than any other monk, and you're working on giving up all identities? Yes, that's all exactly correct. Yep. Lydia says, wouldn't they realize they aren't the body, so there's no gender identity? Ideally, yes. Yes, yeah. If someone is actually following the Buddha's instructions and cultivating the recognition of non-self, that also includes recognizing that the body is not self, and therefore gender is not self, and that therefore gender is ultimately meaningless and has nothing whatsoever to do with awakening. So that's all actually quite correct. Yep. And Hasanta says, are anicca, dukkha, and anatta all sankharas? Well, it depends on what you mean by sankhara. Anicca, dukkha, and anatta are adjectives which describe the characteristics of all sankharas. Does that mean anicca, dukkha, and anatta themselves are sankharas? I guess technically it does, because they're characteristics, and therefore they also are sankharas. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Never thought of it that way, but yeah. And Rick says, what are skillful means when our 4 requisites are not met, especially our medical needs? Well, the Buddha says in that case, your only option is to practice equanimity. Equanimity and patient endurance. When you don't get what you need, so when you do get what you need, then you practice gratitude and contentment, not wanting anything extra or more. And when you don't get what you need, then you practice contentment. You practice equanimity. You practice patient endurance. And Sean says, in a recent teaching, you gave a concise and easy to understand talk on the 5 skandhas. That's good to hear. I don't remember this, but it's good to hear. It says, in it, you define consciousness as the consciousness of the other aggregates. I am 100% certain I did not say that, because I don't use the word aggregates. It says, is there more to that, or is it as simple as it was presented? Yeah, I don't recall ever saying that consciousness is consciousness of the other aggregates. 1, because I don't translate khanda as aggregate. And 2, because I don't define consciousness in that way, because that's not how it's defined in the suttas. In the suttas, the consciousness is defined as awareness of one's sensory domains. So that's how I define it, because that's how it's defined in the suttas. So I don't know who defined consciousness as consciousness of the other aggregates, but it certainly wasn't me. And I'm also not convinced that's an accurate description. And Imo says, okay, this is long. Let me have a look here. Okay, so Imo spoke about their disappointment with samsara, which is all completely understandable, and their interest in becoming a monastic. And then they say, is this a good reason to go forth? Is it good enough of a reason to be a monk? Becoming a monk seems enticing, but I am afraid I am just delusional and too influenced by the emotions of my failing to live. What I would say, Mo, is if you're interested in becoming a monk, then start spending time in monasteries. And usually one of 2 things will happen. Either you will find out that you actually do want to be a monk, in which case you'll start exploring how that can happen. Or you will learn how to be a better Buddhist layperson. That's usually what happens when people spend time in monasteries. They either learn how to be a good monk, or they learn how to be a good layperson. And either way is okay, because that's what monasteries are for. So MO, my recommendation is go and start spending time in monasteries. So when we recognize the general awfulness of samsara, that can be a powerful inspiration to commit oneself thoroughly to a spiritual practice. And if we use it in that way, then it can be a powerful support to our practice. But one needs to learn how to use that perception in a skillful way, a wholesome way, rather than in a depressing or crushing way. So the Buddha did speak about recognizing the general awfulness of samsara, but that's not meant to be a depressing perception. Actually, if it's used correctly, it brings a sense of lightness and ease. It actually brings a sense of joy, of peace and joy. Because when we recognize the general worthlessness of everything conditional, then we naturally stop trying to latch onto it. We stop seeking happiness where it can't be found. And then the result of that is that the mind relaxes into a state of peace and unconditional joy. And if that's not happening, it's usually because there's still some vestiges of clinging. The mind is still on some level trying to reach out and grasp conditional happiness from samsara. So this is where it can actually be quite painful and depressing. It's not when one has a complete perception of the worthlessness of samsara. It's when one has a partial perception. That's where it's painful. If you actually have a complete perception of the worthlessness of samsara, then the mind becomes joyful and serene. But if it's partial, then yes, you can actually fall into a depressed state quite easily. Which again is why you need to go and spend time in monasteries, because that will help you to correct that. If you're using that perception incorrectly, then spending some time in monasteries will help you learn how to correct that misperception. So Kauser Friend says, how is the Brahma-Vihara equanimity to be practiced? Well, one way it's commonly defined is to reflect on karma. To reflect that every person is simply experiencing the consequences of their own past choices, and that each person is creating the choices that will lead to their future experiences. So in this, we recognize that we actually cannot control what anybody else is going through, because ultimately they're just experiencing and generating their own karma. So as much as we might want other people to be this way or that way, it isn't actually up to us, it's up to them. And then also looking at our own experiences, we realize that we actually can't do anything about our current circumstances, because our current circumstances are the product of past choices. But we can make present choices that will change our future conditions. So in this also, the reflection on karma helps us to have equanimity towards our present circumstances. So it's like, oh, right now, I cannot actually do anything about what I'm currently experiencing. All I can do is to accept it with an open heart and a peaceful mind. That's all I can do. And I can work on creating conditions that lead to better circumstances for me in the future. But in the present moment, the only appropriate attitude is one of equanimity, because we can't actually change the present moment at all. So Harry says, when I have experienced piti sukha in the past, excitement/elation comes, and it prevents further progress. How should one practice to abandon this excitement? Just relax, be patient. That goes away on its own in time. Yeah, at some point you actually get kind of bored of the excitement. You might also start to recognize that the excitement itself is a little bit uncomfortable, kind of like needling in your mind. And when you recognize that, then the mind will naturally relax a little bit. And the joy will still be there, but that kind of like sharp, harsh edge of excitement will start fading away. Wasabi-chan says, I've been feeling quite depressed and teary when I received my cat's ashes. I'm feeling very down. Is there any practice I can do to make this easier? Yes, do good deeds and dedicate it to the memory of your departed friend. You can also make a little section of your Buddha shrine. You can have a little section for your cat. You could put their ashes there. You could put a little picture of them there. Put some flowers, change the flowers regularly. And do acts of charity and goodwill, acts of generosity and kindness in honor of your dead friend. Wishing that your good deeds go to their support wherever they're reborn. So those are some things you can do. Okay. So Mo says, I feel deeply envious and angry towards white people because I am an Indigenous woman and feel that any white person with land and the possibility of living in a community stole it from my people. How can I be at peace being dispossessed in this life, given all the social injustice? How can I wish well to those who obtained the life that I want? Well, first off, I would encourage you to recognize that envy and anger are self-destructive mental activities. They will not make you happier. They will only make you more miserable. So no matter how much you justify envy and anger, it is still just self-destruction. That is all. Again, we're very good at convincing ourselves that our anger is justified. We're very good at convincing ourselves that our jealousy is justified. And that does not change the fact that all we're doing is tormenting ourselves. All we're doing is damaging ourselves. So rather than focus on all the perfectly good reasons for your envy and anger, instead focus on how much you're damaging yourself by engaging in those mental activities. And when you pay attention to it in that way, then you will naturally start to drop the envy and anger because you'll see how futile and useless it is. And as for how you can be at peace in this life, well, first of all, do good deeds. Do acts of generosity and kindness. Look for ways to be of benefit. If you feel that you are experiencing misfortune because of the misdeeds of others, well, then do good deeds. Do for others what you wish was being done for you. Do for others what you wish had been done for your ancestors. So do good deeds for others. Help out others. Perform acts of generosity and kindness for others. And also, as far as having grudges towards other people, remember once again, who is it that you're actually angry at? So when you're seeing some 20-year-old person in front of you, did that 20-year-old person steal your ancestors' land? No. It was their ancestors, maybe. Maybe. I mean, my ancestors all came from Europe a few decades ago, so I wasn't involved in stealing anybody's land in this country. So I'm actually not related to anybody who stole indigenous land in this country. So it's not really relevant to me. But even if you're talking to somebody who did in fact have ancestors who stole indigenous land in this country, they are not the person who did it. So they are not karmically responsible for what their ancestors did, just as you are not karmically responsible for what your ancestors did. So karma is personal, as much as anything in samsara can be said to be personal, in the sense that each person is experiencing the consequences of their own karma, not of somebody else's karma. So we are not the inheritors of our ancestors' karma, whether good or evil. So even if your mother did something evil, or your grandfather did something evil, or your uncle did something evil, that does not mean that you have made any bad karma. It means that your relatives made bad karma. It doesn't mean you made bad karma. So even if somebody's ancestors did some evil things, that person is not then de facto an evil person. And it does not mean that they are de facto worthy of, therefore, anger or envy or hostility of any sort. So Mo continues, let's see. I'm afraid of my reasons for wanting to be a Buddhist monk. I've always been rebellious, and the greatest act of rebellion is to give up everything and say to the world I've worked so hard to be a part of, keep your dirty prize, your dull happiness. I'm going to be truly happy. I'm going to follow the Buddha. But this feels like superiority. It feels like revenge, as if I can now make fun of the lay people I once envied. What do you think about this? I think that's a bunch of unwholesome mind states and a bunch of unwholesome attitudes, all of which will just make you miserable. None of it will do you any good. So look at all of that hostility and aversion and negativity in your mind and recognize how painful it is. Recognize the underlying self-centeredness that it's built upon. And recognize that all of that is actually what's preventing you from being happy. So what's preventing you from being happy is not the misdeeds of other people's ancestors. What's preventing you from being happy is not actually even the nature of samsara. What's preventing you from being happy is your own indulgence in aversive, hostile, self-centered mental activities. And of course, if one has a very strong habit of that kind of activity, then even when contemplating something so pure and good as monastic life, one can still bring in those same hostile, harmful mental activities. So watch for that. Watch for that tendency of mind to constantly default to hostility, aversiveness, resentment, recognizing that all of those things are obstacles to your awakening. Okay, Lydia says, why do some monasteries not ordain trans people? Well, as somebody who personally doesn't really care what gender someone is, you're really asking the wrong person, because to me, it's not actually a relevant question. So other monasteries, first of all, it's good to recognize that there's no such thing as a monastery per se. What there is a collection of monks living together, whether for a short time or a long time. And even that collection of monks tends to shift and change over time. So more it's that any particular collection of monks will tend to come to group decisions about what they're comfortable doing and what they're not comfortable doing. And they will do so for their own particular reasons. So the Buddhist world has somewhere around 10 million monks or so worldwide, including both men and women in all Buddhist traditions. That's 10 million different opinions, and 10 million different reasons why they might do something or not do something. So there are a lot of monks who don't see any problem with ordaining trans people, and there's a lot of monks who do. And each one of those monks will have their own reasons for why they think it's okay or not okay. So as someone who personally thinks it's okay, I'm not really concerned in trying to justify why some people think it's not okay. That's for them to justify. I'm not going to do that work for them. Okay. And some more questions. Monal says, how effective is chanting or recitation of suttas for strengthening samatha? Is this a good method to use in order to train the mind that is generally resistant to meditation? If reciting the suttas, do you recommend doing so in Pali, and would you recommend which suttas to focus in on? Okay, how effective is chanting or recitation of suttas for strengthening samatha? I actually think that's pretty effective, to be honest. So it's one reason why in monasteries it's quite common to do a period of chanting before meditation, because it does help to clear the worldly junk out of the mind, and also to recollect Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, to recollect themes of the Buddhist teachings, to cultivate a sense of devotion and respect, reverence and admiration towards Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, all of which prepare the mind for effective meditation practice. So I actually do think it's quite effective. Even just a few minutes of chanting can make quite a big difference. So I personally do notice a distinct difference. And I've heard many other people say similar things, that they can really tell a difference. So I do recommend it. Again, even just a very short chant before meditation can be really useful. And you say, for citing suttas, do you recommend doing so in Pali? I like chanting in Pali, and I like chanting in Pali for a few reasons. One is because it gives me a sense of connection to the Buddha. So the suttas in Pali are the closest thing we have to direct quotations from the Buddha. It's extremely close to the dialect that the Buddha was speaking in. So there's this sense of connection, reaching back over 2,500 years through this long line of Buddhist monks all the way back to the Buddha. So that to me gives this visceral sense of being intimately associated with the Buddha. And also I know the Pali language, so when I chant in Pali, I actually know what I'm saying. And of course, chanting in Pali then means reciting the Dhamma and reminding oneself of the Dhamma. For someone who is more interested in the meaning, if you don't know Pali, then it can be quite useful to recite in a language that you do understand. And in many monasteries, they will recite in Pali and in the local language. So here in the US, a lot of monasteries will do chanting both in Pali and in English. And that's so that people can get both. They both get the sense of connection to the ancient tradition, connection to the Buddha, and also some sense of the meaning of the words. The problem is that most of the English chanting books I've seen have quite bad translations, quite inaccurate translations. So they give you a general vague idea of the meaning, but it's often quite imprecise. As for which suttas to focus in on, it kind of depends on what inspires you. So something devotional and also something doctrinal. That's what I'd recommend. If you're going to chant two things, chant one that's devotional and one that's doctrinal. And in either case, it should be something that inspires you, something that you feel some personal inspiration from. Victoria says, this morning I moved a dead animal from the middle of the road so cars wouldn't run over it. I wished out loud for it to have a wonderful rebirth. Oh, that's very sweet. Did the Buddha say anything about helping animals have a positive rebirth? Yeah, I mean, just generally wishing for any deceased person, so whether that person had a human body or an animal body, doesn't actually make a difference. Wishing for any deceased person to have a healthy, happy life with good teachers, good friends, good relatives, good support, and most importantly, for them to have the opportunity to practice the Dhamma and attain awakening. So yeah, absolutely. Wishing in this way for deceased animals is definitely something that we find mentioned in the suttas. And Yong asks, is there an age limit to be a monk? Technically, no. There is a minimum age. To be a fully ordained monk, the minimum age is 20, though there's a couple interesting exceptions to that, which I won't go into. But generally speaking, the minimum age is 20. To be a novice monk, there's actually no minimum age. It's just what it actually says in the suttas is that one has to be big enough to chase away crows, which in Buddhist tradition, that's usually been estimated as about 7 years old, which I think is actually a little bit high. I think probably a 5-year-old could chase away crows. Two-year-old could chase away crows. 1.5, yeah. So actually, maybe that's really not the most useful metric. I wouldn't ordain a 2-year-old personally. Anyway, but there's no upper age limit, though any given community will often have internal guidelines for who they're willing to ordain, which might include age limits. But there's also plenty of monasteries where you could be literally like 95 years old and about to die next week, and they would be like, come in, here's a robe, here's a bowl, have a seat. I actually know of a monastery in California, which is basically a retirement home for elderly Buddhists. So it's all full of people in their 70s, 80s, 90s who decide that they want to spend the last years of their life as monks. So they have the men's section of the monastery, the women's section of the monastery, and a lot of them, also cute, a lot of them are actually married people who decided that they wanted to end their lives living as celibate monks in the same monastery, which again is just adorable. I actually love traditional Buddhism. There's all these really cute things. Okay, so Harry says, how does one, quote, see danger in the slightest fault, unquote, in our sila without becoming paranoid about making a fault? So that line from the suttas is Vayadasavi. So saying, let's see. Anumatesu vajesu Vayadasavi. So seeing, even minor errors as dangerous. So what this is more talking about is it's not justifying minor misconduct. So people say things like, oh, it's just a white lie. Or they say something like, yeah, I stole it, but it was only like $5. Or they'll say something like, yeah, I cheated on my wife, but it was just once or twice, or maybe 3 times. And it's like, well, no, don't justify these things. If you do something wrong, then be honest with yourself. Oh, I did something wrong, and I'm going to try not to do it again. And if you find yourself tempted to do something wrong, then remind yourself, no, this is dangerous. If I engage in unwholesome behaviors, it's dangerous. It makes my mind drift farther from awakening, farther from wisdom, farther from happiness, farther from serenity. Why would I want that? It's kind of like if you're putting condiments on your food and you're like, salt, okay, pepper, okay, cyanide, maybe not the cyanide today, hemlock, maybe I'll skip the hemlock too. So you just recognize, like, these ones are harmless, that one is harmful. So it's the same. When making your choices in life, you evaluate harmless, harmful. When you recognize a harmful choice, then you just don't put that in your mind. You just don't go there. Even if it seems like, oh, it's just slightly harmful. Like, oh, I only put a little bit of hemlock in my salad today. I only put a little bit of cyanide in my drinking water today. It's like, well, how about 0? Let's try to aim for a harmless life, which also includes harmless to ourselves. And if you do make mistakes, then you also forgive yourself. It's recognizing, of course I'm going to make mistakes. I'm another delusional being like everybody else, full of greed, hatred, and delusion, just like all the other unenlightened people. So of course we make mistakes sometimes. So we forgive ourselves and we reestablish our commitment to do better, and we move on. And Kauser Friend says, thank you for spending time every week to answer our questions. I appreciate it a lot. Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. And A says, is this metta if in my meditation I pray, may I forgive myself for all my mistakes, and may everyone forgive each other for the hurt they might feel. May all beings forgive and abide in peace. Oh, that's quite lovely. Yeah, that's quite nice. Yeah, I would say that's part of metta practice. Okay. Amaranta says, this week you taught about the sutta of full moon night. You ended the session, but I had a question. It's about this affirmation. And then here's a quote from the suttas. It says, these 5 components affected by grasping are rooted in desire. Is the grasping the same thing as the 5 components, or is grasping one thing and the 5 components another? The Buddha says neither, rather the desire and greed for them is the grasping there. And Amaranta says, can you clarify about if it is consciousness with the impulse of desire that causes the 5 khandhas? Okay. If it is consciousness with the impulse of desire that causes the 5 khandhas. Well, properly speaking, if we want to talk about paticca samuppada, then the 5 khandhas are namarupa, which arises from, so avijja paccaya sankhara, sankhara paccaya vijnana, vijnana paccaya namarupa. So from ignorance, the fundamental ignorance of anicca, dukkha, anatta, then there arises sankhara. So mental activities motivated by delusion. And those mental activities motivated by delusion give rise to vijnana, give rise to consciousness or awareness. So again, delusion tainted awareness. And then that is what gives rise to the experience of body and mind as me. So from the delusion of self, then there arises the attempt to pin self-identity on something. And what we pin it on is body and mind. the 5 khandhas, the 5 components of being. So that's what I would answer. I would say it's not necessarily consciousness with the impulse of desire, but rather I would say the fundamental ignorance of non-self, the fundamental delusion of self is what leads to us generating a self-identity based upon body and mind. And Emo says, how to know which is the best tradition to join to become a Buddhist monastic? I'm interested in Vajrayana, but I've mostly met Theravada monks. Through experience, visit different places, see what feels right to you. So that's the best way. There's a lot of different kinds of Buddhism. So get some experience with a few different kinds and see what you feel the most naturally drawn towards. See what speaks to you, see what feels right to you. And Tannik says, is engaging in sensual pleasure the same as engaging in unwholesome activities? So one thing that's important to understand is it's quite clearly explained in the suttas that just to experience pleasure does not necessarily mean you're doing something unwholesome. So an awakened being also experiences both pleasure and pain. That's not inherently harmful. What is harmful is desire and attachment in relationship to pleasant experiences. So if you're going out of your way to engage in an activity purely because you want to experience pleasure and not for any other reason, then that is unwholesome because it is fueling desire and attachment. But if, for example, you're eating a nice healthy meal and that nice healthy meal also happens to taste good, well, that's not unwholesome because your motivation is not about the reckless pursuit of pleasure. It's not about the blind impulse of seeking pleasure. It's not about desire, but rather it's about the appropriate usage of the 4 requisites, the appropriate usage of food in this case. And Emo says, is it necessary to find a teacher to be a monk? Yes. How to find a teacher? Visit monasteries. Spend time in monasteries. Okay, and that's actually the last question. So that might be it for this evening. Once again, it's delightful to have a chance to discuss Buddhism with all of you, and I hope we'll see you again either this weekend for those who live close by the monastery. You can come and join in, or on our live streams next week for those who are not close by. So we'll conclude the session with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.